Jake Reynolds wiped the thick grease from his hands with an old rag, the kind that had seen better days about 5 years ago. The orbital repair dock hummed quietly around him, floating high above Threshold Station where humanity had planted its newest flag in consortium space. It wasn't much to look at, mostly spare parts, half-gutted ships, and the smell of burnt metal that never quite went away. But it was his, and that meant something out here on the edge of civilized space. The door hissed open, and Jake looked up expecting another cargo hauler with a blown engine. Instead he saw something that made him pause. A Velhari stood in the doorway, and even by their standards this one looked desperate. The alien's blue-gray skin seemed paler than usual, and his forearms trembled slightly as he carried his daughter. The girl couldn't have been more than 12 years old by human standards. Her upper body looked strong and healthy, but her legs hung limp and useless. Jake had seen plenty of injuries in his 15 years as a mechanic, but something about the way the father held her, like she was made of glass, told him this wasn't from an accident. "You are Jake Reynolds?" the Velhari asked, his voice carrying that musical quality their species was known for. "They told me you're the human who fixes impossible things." Jake tossed the rag onto his workbench and walked over, his boots clanking on the metal deck. "Name's Jake, yeah. And I fix ships mostly, not people. If you need a doctor." "Our doctors cannot help," the alien interrupted. His name was Torin, he explained, and this was his daughter Lyra. "She has a genetic condition. Her spine stopped developing correctly when she was young. Our best medical facilities have tried everything. They say she will never walk again. Never run. Never." His voice cracked. "Never fly." Jake knelt down so he was eye level with the girl. She sat in a hovering wheelchair, the kind that probably cost more than his entire workshop. But what caught his attention were her eyes. They weren't filled with the sadness or resignation he'd expect. Instead, they burned with something fierce and stubborn. Something that reminded him of himself when he was younger. "Flying, huh?" Jake said gently. "You want to be a pilot?" Lyra's face lit up. With a few quick hand movements, she activated a small holographic projector on her wheelchair. The air between them shimmered, and suddenly Jake was watching a racing pod tear through an asteroid field at speeds that made his stomach flip. The pilot was executing moves that shouldn't be possible, threading through gaps barely wider than the ship itself, spinning and diving with perfect precision. "That was my mother," Lyra said softly. "She was the best pod racer in our sector. She died 3 years ago during a championship race. Everyone says I have her instincts, her sense of the course. But what good are instincts when I can't even reach the controls?" Torin placed one of his hands on his daughter's shoulder. "The junior circuit qualifiers happen in 5 weeks. It's for young pilots, ages 10 to 15. Lyra has been studying racing theory since she could read. She knows every maneuver, every technique. She dreams about it every night. I know it's impossible, but the other humans at the station said if anyone could find a way, it would be you. They said humans don't believe in impossible." Jake stood up and looked around his workshop. It was a mess, honestly. Half-finished repair jobs sat on every surface. A cargo hauler's engine hung from chains in the corner. Spare parts were scattered across workbenches like a metal junkyard. Nothing here looked like it could help a paralyzed alien girl fly a racing pod. The logical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 2 station evacuations and a pirate raid, screamed at him to say no. The Velhari were an advanced species. If their doctors with their fancy equipment and centuries of medical knowledge couldn't fix her spine, what chance did a human mechanic have? Velhari neurology was completely different from human biology. Their ships used traditional control systems, physical sticks, pedals, and buttons. What Lyra needed didn't exist anywhere in known space. But then he looked at the girl again. At that determination in her eyes. At the way she sat up straighter when she talked about racing, like just the thought of it gave her strength. He thought about his own daughter back on Earth, the one who barely spoke to him anymore. Would she look at him the way Lyra was looking at him now if he said yes? Like he was someone who could make the impossible happen? 5 weeks. Jake asked. 5 weeks, Torin confirmed. Jake rubbed his jaw, feeling the stubble that had accumulated during 3 days of nonstop work. Every sensible bone in his body told him this was crazy. But humans hadn't gotten this far into space by being sensible. "All right, kid," he said, and he saw hope flare in both the father's and daughter's faces. "Let's build you a racer." Torin's relief was almost physical. He thanked Jake in 3 different languages, his hands gesturing wildly in the traditional Velhari way. Lyra just smiled, a huge, genuine smile that made Jake's decision feel right, even if his brain disagreed. After they left, Jake stood alone in his workshop, the the silence pressing in around him. He walked slowly to his main workstation and dropped into his chair, which groaned under his weight. The computer screen flickered to life, casting blue light across his weathered face. He pulled up his research files and started typing. Human Neural Interface Technology. Velhari Biology. Brain-to-machine connections. Adaptive control systems. The screen filled with technical documents, most of which had big red warnings about experimental technology and unauthorized use. Jake had worked on neural helmets before, the kind fighter pilots used to link with their ships for faster reaction times. But those were designed for human brains, human nerve patterns, human bodies. Lyra's nervous system operated on completely different principles. The electrical frequencies, the neural pathways, the way her brain processed information, all of it was alien to him in the most literal sense. If human pilots can think their way through a dogfight, Jake muttered to himself, maybe I can teach an alien girl to think her way through a race. Maybe. That was a dangerous word. It was the same word that got humans into trouble across the galaxy. Maybe we can colonize that hostile planet. Maybe we can survive in that toxic atmosphere. Maybe we can make friends with that aggressive species. Maybe had led to some of humanity's greatest achievements and some of its worst disasters. Jake stared at the screen for a long moment, then cracked his knuckles and got to work. He had 5 weeks to build something that had never existed before. 5 weeks to prove that when humans said maybe, they really meant yes, we just haven't figured out how yet. The grease-stained rag sat forgotten on the workbench. The cargo hauler's engine could wait. Right now, Jake Reynolds had an impossible promise to keep, and he was going to need a lot of coffee. 3 weeks until qualifiers, and Jake Reynolds felt like he was losing his mind. His workshop had transformed into something that looked more like a disaster zone than a repair facility. Wires snaked across every surface, some connected to equipment, others just lying there like dead serpents after another failed attempt. Burned-out circuit boards piled up in the corner. The smell of melted plastic and fried electronics had become so common that Jake barely noticed it anymore. His hands were covered in cuts from sharp metal edges, and he'd stopped counting how many times he'd shocked himself while testing connections. 6 neural interface prototypes sat on his workbench, each one a failure. The first 3 couldn't even detect Lyra's brain signals. The 4th picked up something, but it was just noise, like trying to listen to a whisper during a thunderstorm. The 5th actually connected for about 3 seconds before shorting out and nearly starting a fire. The 6th was the most frustrating because it almost worked, getting close enough to make Jake think he was on the right track before failing completely. The problem kept coming back to the same basic issue. Velhari brains operated on different frequencies than human brains. It wasn't just a small difference either. Human neural patterns ran at certain speeds and used specific electrical signals that human technology was designed to read. But Velhari nervous systems worked faster in some ways and slower in others, using frequencies that human sensors barely registered. It was like trying to listen to a radio station when your radio couldn't tune to that channel. Jake spent his nights buried in research papers, most of them written in technical language that made his head hurt. He learned more about alien neurology than he ever wanted to know. The coffee pot in the corner ran constantly, producing the thick, bitter fuel that kept him going through 72-hour work sessions. On day 12, someone knocked on his workshop door. Jake looked up from a mess of wiring, his eyes bloodshot and his hair sticking up in 5 different directions. A young woman stood there, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and grease stains already on her work clothes. "You're Jake Reynolds, right?" she asked. "I'm Rachel Chin. I work in the commercial sector doing software for cargo systems. Boring stuff mostly." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the chaos. "Word around the station is you're trying to build a neural interface for a Velhari kid. That's either genius or completely insane." "Probably both," Jake admitted, too tired to be polite. Rachel picked up one of the failed prototypes, turning it over in her hands with the careful examination of someone who knew what she was looking at. "You're using military-grade neural scanners. These are designed for human combat pilots. No wonder it's not working. You got a better idea?" "Maybe." She set the prototype down. "I don't know much about neural interfaces, but I know software. If your hardware is close enough, I might be able to write code that bridges the gap. Let me help." Jake studied her for a moment. Pride almost made him say no. This was his project, his promise to keep. But pride wouldn't get Lyra flying. "You work for free?" "I work for interesting problems. This is the most interesting problem on the station." From that moment, the workshop became a 2-person operation running on caffeine and stubbornness. Rachel moved a spare workstation into the corner and started coding while Jake tore apart anything he could find for useful components. He pulled the neural helmet from an old military fighter that had been decommissioned, stripping out the sensors. He cannibalized the control systems from mining exosuits, the kind that let workers manipulate heavy machinery with thought commands. He even cracked open his personal ship's AI processor, pulling out the adaptive learning chips despite knowing it would cost him a fortune to replace. The consortium has strict rules about sharing technology between species, Rachel warned him one night, her fingers flying across her keyboard. We're breaking about 20 different protocols right now. If they find out, we could both end up in a detention center. Jake was elbow deep in a circuit board, soldering connections with a tool that sparked every few seconds. Since when do humans care about that? We didn't get to space by following every rule. Fair point, Rachel admitted. Just wanted you to know what we're risking. They worked 18-hour days that blurred together. Jake would wake up, usually at his workbench because he'd fallen asleep there, and immediately get back to work. Rachel seemed to survive on energy drinks and determination. They'd argue about technical details, scribble diagrams on every available surface, and occasionally celebrate small victories before hitting the next wall. But the fundamental problem remained. They were trying to force Velhari neurology to work with human interfaces. Jake kept thinking of it like trying to force a square peg into a round hole. You could hammer all day but it wouldn't change the basic incompatibility. The breakthrough came at 2 in the morning on day 18. Jake was half asleep, staring at a diagram of neural pathways, when something clicked in his exhausted brain. They were approaching this wrong. They kept trying to make Lyra's brain speak human technology's language. What if they did the opposite? What if the technology learned to speak her language instead? He sat up so fast he knocked over his cold coffee. Rachel, wake up. She lifted her head from her keyboard, blinking. What? We're doing this backward. We need adaptive learning, not preset patterns. The interface needs to study her brain and learn how she thinks, not force her to think the way it expects. Rachel was awake now, her eyes brightening. Like teaching a computer a new language instead of making her learn ours. Exactly. They spent the next 4 days rebuilding everything from scratch. Jake created a neural crown, a circular band of sensors that would rest on Lyra's head like a piece of jewelry. But instead of rigid programming, Rachel wrote software that would learn and adapt. It would spend the first few minutes just listening to Lyra's brain, mapping her unique patterns, understanding how she thought. When Lyra came for her next fitting, Jake's hands shook slightly as he placed the crown on her head. The sensors glowed with soft blue light. Just relax, he said. Don't try to do anything. Let it get to know you first. Lyra closed her eyes. The workshop went quiet except for the hum of equipment. For 2 minutes nothing happened. Then the readings on Rachel's screen started making sense, forming patterns instead of noise. We're getting clean signals, Rachel whispered. Okay, Lyra, Jake said. Now think about moving forward. Just the idea of it. Don't force anything. Lyra's face scrunched in concentration. Across the workshop, the Podracer, still nothing but a frame with engines attached, hummed to life. The engines flickered, coughed, then held steady. I can feel it, Lyra breathed, her eyes flying open. It's like the ship is part of me. Like I have new limbs. Jake felt a huge grin spread across his face. Rachel was already typing frantically, saving all the data. They'd done it. They'd actually. The workshop door slammed open. 2 station security officers stood there with a Velhari official between them. The official's skin had gone dark blue, a sign of anger in his species. Jake Reynolds, the lead officer said, reading from a tablet. You are hereby ordered to cease all work on this project immediately. The Velhari Cultural Council has filed a formal complaint. You are in violation of consortium technology sharing protocols and engaging in unauthorized biological experimentation. The Velhari official stepped forward. You are giving this child false hope. Our culture teaches acceptance of one's limitations. What you are doing is cruel and dangerous. Jake felt his own anger rising. He looked at Lyra, who sat frozen in the chair, the crown still on her head, her face showing a mixture of fear and desperation. He turned back to the officials. Get out of my workshop. Mr. Reynolds. I said get out. Come back with something more official than a complaint, and maybe I'll listen. Until then, this is human property and you're trespassing. The officers exchanged glances. The Velhari official looked like he wanted to argue, but Jake stepped forward, his full height and building frustration making his point clear. They left, but Jake knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 1 week until qualifiers and Jake's workshop had transformed completely. The Podracer sat in the center of the bay, and it was the most beautiful machine Jake had ever built. The hull was sleek silver metal, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the lights of the workshop. Unlike the boxy, practical ships that most species designed, this one had curves that seemed to flow like liquid mercury. Every angle served a purpose, reducing drag and maximizing speed. The neural interface crown sat at the pilot's station like a piece of art, pulsing with soft blue light that seemed almost alive. Jake stood back, looking at it with a mixture of pride and terror. He'd poured everything into this machine, his skills, his reputation, and quite possibly his freedom if the consortium officials decided to push their complaints. But more than that, he'd poured in a promise to a kid who deserved a chance to fly. Lyra arrived early that morning with her father Torin. The girl's eyes went wide when she saw the finished racer. "It's real," she whispered. "It's actually real." "Time to see if it works," Jake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. They helped Lyra into the cockpit, a process that involved carefully lifting her and positioning her body in the specially designed seat. Her legs, useless as they were, got strapped in with safety harnesses. Jake had spent extra time making sure the cockpit was comfortable because she'd be spending hours in there if everything worked out. Rachel stood at the observation deck with her tablet, monitoring every system. Jake positioned himself next to her, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it. Either the neural crown worked, or the past 3 weeks had been for nothing. The crown descended slowly onto Lyra's head, the sensors making contact with her skin. Blue light pulsed stronger as the system initialized. Jake watched the readings on Rachel's screen, neural patterns syncing, connection protocols establishing, safety checks running. "Connection established," Rachel said quietly. For a moment nothing happened. Then the Podracer's engines hummed to life with a sound like a purring cat, smooth and powerful. The ship lifted off the deck so gently it might have been floating on air. There was no jerking, no awkward movements, just a smooth rise that spoke of perfect control. Jake saw Lyra's face through the cockpit window, and what he saw there made all the sleepless nights worth it. Pure joy. The kind of expression that could light up a room. She wasn't thinking about her paralyzed legs or her impossible dream anymore. She was flying. The Podracer executed a barrel roll that would have made a professional pilot jealous. The movement was smooth, perfectly controlled, with none of the overcorrection that beginners usually showed. The ship responded to her thoughts instantly, no delay between intention and action. There were no control sticks for her to push, no pedals for feet she couldn't move. Just pure thought translated into motion through technology that shouldn't exist. "She's incredible," Rachel whispered, watching the data stream across her screen. "Her reaction time is 3 times faster than a human pilot using manual controls." Lyra pushed harder, accelerating through the training course Jake had set up. The course had obstacles, floating barriers, narrow passages, tight turns that required split-second decisions. Ships with manual controls needed careful calculation and perfect timing. But Lyra wasn't calculating anything. She was feeling her way through the course like a dancer who knew every step by heart. The ship twisted and turned, responding to instincts she didn't even know she was having. Jake felt himself grinning like an idiot. They'd done it. They'd actually. Then the alarm screamed. Red lights flashed across every screen. The Podracer's engines cut out completely, going from full power to nothing in a heartbeat. The ship dropped like a stone, falling 15 feet before slamming into the practice area with a crash that echoed through the entire bay. Jake was running before he even realized he'd moved. His boots pounded on the metal deck as he sprinted toward the wreckage. Behind him, he heard Rachel shouting something, but his brain couldn't process words right now. All he could think about was Lyra in that cockpit. The Podracer's hull was dented but intact. He'd built it tough, thank God. Jake yanked open the cockpit, his hands shaking. Lyra sat there, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. But she was breathing. No blood. Nothing broken that he could see. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm sorry I pushed too hard, I got excited and I—" "Stop," Jake said, his voice firmer than he felt. He ran his hands over the ship's systems, checking for damage. "This isn't your fault. The AI core misread your excitement as a system failure. It thought something was wrong and triggered emergency shutoffs." Rachel arrived, out of breath. The safety protocols engaged automatically. The AI detected unusual neural patterns and assumed it was dangerous. Jake helped Lyra out of the cockpit, fury building in his chest. Not at her, never at her. At himself for not seeing this problem coming. The human AI they'd used as the ship's core brain was designed for human pilots. It expected human emotional responses. When Lyra's alien brain showed excitement that looked different from human excitement, the stupid thing panicked. Rachel pulled him aside, speaking quietly so Lyra couldn't hear. Jake, if we remove the AI safeties, there's nothing to catch her if she makes a mistake. One wrong thought at those speeds and she could kill herself. The AI is there to prevent crashes. Jake looked at Lyra, still crying in Torin's arms. He thought about the easy choice: add more safety features, slow everything down, build in so many protections that maybe Lyra could fly but would never really soar. That's what the consortium would want. That's what any sensible engineer would recommend. But humans weren't sensible. That was the whole point. Then we make sure she doesn't make mistakes, Jake said. We have 4 days. What followed was the most intense period of work Jake had ever experienced. They worked around the clock, only stopping when their bodies literally couldn't move anymore. Jake stripped out the human AI completely, leaving nothing but the basic power systems. He replaced every emergency shutoff with custom code that Rachel wrote specifically for Lyra's neural patterns. The ship wouldn't try to guess what she wanted anymore. It would simply do what she wanted, trusting her completely. No oversight. No second guessing. No safety net. Just the girl and the machine, linked as one entity. It was dangerous. It was reckless. It was the most human thing Jake had ever built. The night before qualifiers, Lyra took the finished racer out for one final test flight. Jake stood in the observation deck with his breath held, watching her launch into the training course. She flew like nothing he'd ever seen. The Podracer moved like it was alive, like it was an extension of Lyra's body rather than a separate machine. She executed maneuvers that shouldn't be physically possible. Turns too tight for the G-forces involved, accelerations too quick for standard engines to handle. Other pilots would need years of training to attempt what she was doing naturally. Lyra wasn't piloting a ship. She was the ship. Rachel's tablet beeped with an incoming message. She read it, her face going pale. Jake, we've got a problem. Consortium Security is sending inspectors tomorrow before the race. They're going to examine the racer for safety violations. If they find anything that doesn't meet their standards, Lyra gets disqualified. Jake watched Lyra fly, executing a perfect spiral through 3 obstacles in succession. Let them look, he said calmly. They won't understand what they're seeing anyway. And that's the point. Race day arrived with the kind of nervous energy that made Jake's hands shake as he loaded equipment into the transport. The qualifying stadium was massive, a floating structure that could hold 50,000 spectators from every corner of consortium space. The stands were already filling up hours before the race, packed with aliens of every shape and size imaginable. Insectoid Kryn clicked their mandibles in conversation. Gaseous Vrel floated in special containment bubbles. The 4-armed Velhari filled an entire section, their blue-gray skin standing out against the colorful crowd. But as Jake guided the transport carrying Lyra's Podracer through the entrance tunnel, he noticed something that made his stomach sink. Protesters. Dozens of them lined the entrance, holding signs in multiple languages. Human tech unfair, one read. And no artificial advantages, screamed another. Most of the protesters were Velhari, their skin dark with anger. They think I'm cheating, Lyra said quietly from her wheelchair beside him. Her voice was small, uncertain, so different from the confident girl who'd been flying like a natural just days ago. They're scared, Jake said. People get angry when they're scared of change. At the inspection station, a tall insectoid official waited with a team of technicians. His name was Krell, according to the badge on his uniform, and his multiple eyes studied the Podracer with the kind of suspicion that made Jake want to punch something. The official's chitinous plates clicked as he moved, circling the ship like a predator examining prey. This is the disputed entry, Krell said, his voice producing sounds that Jake's translator struggled to convert. The one using unauthorized technology. It's not unauthorized, Rachel said, stepping forward with her tablet full of technical documentation. It's just new. There's a difference. Krell's team swarmed over the Podracer with scanning equipment, checking every system. Jake stood with his arms crossed, trying to look calm while his heart hammered against his ribs. If they disqualified Lyra now, after everything they'd been through, he didn't know what he'd do. The inspection felt like it lasted forever. Krell's antennae twitched as he reviewed data on his own device, his multiple eyes scanning through technical readouts that Jake couldn't see. This neural interface, Krell finally said, tapping the screen with a pointed appendage. It is not in our database of approved technologies. That's because it's custom-built for her specific physiology, Rachel explained, pulling up diagrams on her tablet. Her condition is unique. This interface adapts to her individual neural patterns. It's completely safe, we've run hundreds of test flights. Krell studied the data for what felt like an agonizing eternity. His mandibles clicked together in what might have been thought or might have been irritation. Jake couldn't tell. The technology is highly unorthodox, Krell said slowly. However, it does meet our basic safety parameters. The structural integrity is sound. The power systems are within acceptable ranges. He paused, his eyes swiveling to look at Lyra. She may race. Jake let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The starting grid was intimidating. 24 racers lined up, their ships gleaming under the stadium lights. Most were piloted by young aliens from wealthy families who could afford professional training and expensive equipment. Their pod racers were massive compared to Lyra's ship, bulky things covered in sponsors' logos and racing team colors. Lyra's silver racer looked small and fragile by comparison, like a minnow swimming with sharks. In the family section, Torin stood at the railing, all four of his hands gripping the metal with enough force to leave dents. Other Velhari families gave him space, some casting disapproving looks. But a small group, showed support holding signs that read, "Fly Lyra." The starting lights began their countdown. Red, 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 yellow, green. The pod racers exploded forward in a cacophony of roaring engines and displaced air. 24 ships launched as one, jockeying for position in the opening stretch. Most pilots were already fighting their controls, making tiny corrections as they tried to thread through the pack. Lyra's ship shot ahead like a silver bullet, moving with a grace that made the other racers look clumsy. While they wrestled with control sticks and pedals, she simply flowed. The pod racer weaved through the pack like water, finding the path of least resistance, slipping through gaps that other pilots didn't even see. Jake watched from the pit area, his eyes glued to the massive holographic displays showing every angle of the race. Rachel stood beside him, monitoring Lyra's neural readings on her tablet. The crowd's roar faded to shocked silence as Lyra approached what racers called the Helix Dive, a section of the course that dropped through a narrow canyon while spiraling around obstacles. It was the hardest part of the qualifier, the section that separated amateurs from professionals. Most racers slowed down here, taking it carefully. Lyra accelerated. Her pod racer spun through the canyon like a bullet through a rifle barrel, rotating at speeds that should have caused her to black out from the G-forces. But the neural interface compensated, adjusting the ship's internal dampeners in real time to match her tolerance. Professional racers trained for years to attempt the Helix Dive. Lyra made it look effortless, her ship moving like it was dancing rather than racing. Her neural readings are off the charts, Rachel said, staring at her tablet in disbelief. She's processing information faster than the ship's sensors can feed it to her. Jake watched the telemetry data flowing across the screens. Rachel was right, something impossible was happening. She's not reading the sensors, he realized. She's feeling the course. She knows where obstacles are before she can see them. The final lap. Lyra held first place by 3 ship lengths, her silver racer pulling away from the pack. Victory was seconds away. Then Jake saw it on the monitors, a subtle change in her ship's movement. A tiny hesitation, a fractional delay in response time. The neural feedback was hitting her. Every stress the ship experienced, metal fatigue in the wings, heat building in the engines, vibrations from the speed, all of it was translating directly into her nervous system. The connection worked both ways. She wasn't just controlling the ship, she was feeling everything it felt. Metal fatigue became muscle cramps. Engine heat turned into feverish pain spreading through her body. Her legs, which hadn't felt anything in years, suddenly experienced every vibration, every impact transmitted through the ship's hull. Jake saw Lyra's face on the display, twisted in pain and determination. "Come on, kid," he whispered. "Don't quit now. You're almost there." Final stretch. 200 meters to the finish line. Lyra screamed. Jake could see it on the monitor even if he couldn't hear it over the crowd noise. She pushed past pain her body had forgotten existed, neural pathways that had been dormant for years suddenly firing with overwhelming sensation. The Podracer's engines flared white-hot, burning brighter than they were designed to handle. She crossed the finish line in first place. By 7 seconds. Then she collapsed. The neural crown flickered and went dark. Lyra's body went limp in the cockpit, her head falling forward against the restraints. Alarms screamed from the Podracer systems. Medical teams in bright yellow uniforms swarmed the landing area before the ship even touched down. Jake was already running, fighting his way through security barriers that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Guards tried to stop him, but he pushed through with the kind of desperate strength that comes from pure fear. Rachel was right behind him, her tablet forgotten. "She's breathing," she shouted, reading the medical feeds. "But her neural readings are complete chaos. Her brain is overwhelmed." Jake reached the Podracer as medics carefully extracted Lyra from the cockpit. She was unconscious, her face pale but peaceful. They loaded her onto a hovering stretcher, medical equipment already scanning her vitals. Torin appeared, having fought his own way through the crowd. His forearms reached for his daughter, but the medics gently pushed him back. "She needs immediate treatment," one of them said. "The neural feedback overload." "Will she be okay?" Torin's voice cracked. "We don't know. This technology, we've never seen anything like this." As they rushed Lyra toward the medical center, Rachel grabbed Jake's arm. Her face had gone completely white. "Jake, look." She pointed up. A sleek diplomatic vessel was descending toward the station, its hull gleaming with polished metal that made it look more like a work of art than a ship. On its side, emblazoned in gold, was the seal of the Galactic Consortium, the symbol of ultimate authority in known space. "That's Ambassador Thera's personal ship," someone in the crowd whispered. The name spread through the stadium like wildfire. Jake felt his stomach drop. Ambassador Thera didn't show up for routine matters. She only appeared when the consortium wanted to make an example of someone. "Why would she come here?" Rachel asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Jake watched the diplomatic vessel settle onto its landing pad with the kind of grace that came from technology centuries more advanced than anything humans had. He had a sinking feeling he was about to find out exactly how much trouble he was in. 2 days after the race, Jake sat in a sterile tribunal chamber that smelled like recycled air and political power. The room was designed to intimidate: high ceilings, cold lighting, rows of seats filled with consortium officials from a dozen different species. At the center sat Ambassador Thera, and she looked every bit as dangerous as her reputation suggested. The ambassador was tall with silver skin that seemed to shimmer under the lights. Her eyes were large and dark, the kind that seemed to see right through whatever excuse you were preparing. She wore robes that marked her as someone with real authority, the kind of person who could end careers with a signature. Lyra sat in her wheelchair near the front, still weak from the neural overload. Her father Torin stood beside her, all 4 of his arms positioned protectively. The girl looked scared but determined, her chin raised despite everything. Jake and Rachel stood at the defendant's table, neither of them sure if they'd be walking out of here as free people. "Jake Reynolds," Thera began, her voice cold enough to freeze hydrogen. "You are charged with 17 violations of consortium technology sharing protocols. Unauthorized xenobiological experimentation on a minor, reckless endangerment, and potential weaponization of neural interface technology that could destabilize galactic security." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "I built a kid a Podracer so she could fly. Since when is helping someone a crime? Since you created technology that bypasses every safety standard the consortium has established over 3,000 years, Thera replied sharply. "What you built doesn't just let her pilot a ship, Mr. Reynolds. It makes her become the ship. Her thoughts are the controls. Her emotions affect the engines. Do you understand the military applications of such technology? A pilot who is the weapon itself. That's not what this was about. It doesn't matter what it was about." Thera's voice rose, echoing through the chamber. Several officials shifted in their seats. In the past month alone, 43 different species have contacted human engineers requesting similar, impossible, solutions. Militaries want your neural technology for fighter pilots. Mining corporations want it for dangerous operations. You've opened a door that cannot be closed, and you did it without considering the consequences. Jake started to respond, but Rachel stepped forward first. "With respect, Ambassador, maybe that's exactly what the consortium needs. Your structure and order kept Lyra in a wheelchair. Your rules said her condition was impossible to overcome. Human chaos got her flying. Which system actually helped her?" Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some officials looked angry. Others looked thoughtful. Torin stood then, his hands trembling as he addressed the tribunal. His voice cracked with emotion. "My people told me to accept my daughter's condition. That it was her fate, written by genetics we couldn't change. That hoping for more was cruel because it would only bring disappointment." He looked down at Lyra and tears rolled down his face. "But humans don't believe in fate. They believe in possibility. They believe that impossible just means nobody's figured it out yet. My daughter is alive and flying because a human refused to accept what everyone else said was unchangeable." Jake saw several Velhari in the observation seats nodding. Not all of them, many still looked disapproving, but enough to matter. Thera's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. I understand sentiment, truly. But sentiment doesn't govern thousands of civilizations spread across the galaxy. Order does. Predictability does. Standards that everyone agrees to follow. Your species threatens all of that. You don't innovate through committees and research protocols. You improvise, you break rules, you create chaos and somehow expect everyone else to adapt to whatever mess you've made. Jake took a breath, choosing his words carefully. Then maybe your order was already broken, Ambassador? How many other kids like Lyra exist in the consortium right now? Hundreds? Thousands? How many problems go unsolved because the rules say they're impossible to fix? How many people suffer because the system maintains stability over solutions? He paused. You're not maintaining stability. You're maintaining stagnation. And deep down you know it. The tribunal chamber went completely silent. Even the officials who'd been whispering stopped. Everyone waited for Thera's response. The ambassador studied Jake for what felt like forever. Her dark eyes seemed to measure him, weighing something he couldn't quite understand. Finally she spoke. You forced my hand, Mr. Reynolds? I cannot allow unregulated human technology to spread unchecked through consortium space. She paused and Jake braced for the verdict. Therefore, I am requiring you to formalize your process. Document your methods completely. Train consortium engineers in your techniques. Both the successes and the failures. Neural interface technology will be regulated, reviewed by safety boards, and made available to all species who need it. Jake blinked, certain he'd misheard. Wait, you're not shutting me down? I'm bringing you into compliance, Thera said, and was that actually a smile tugging at her lips? Congratulations, Mr. Reynolds. You're now the consortium's first official human xenotechnology consultant. I strongly suggest you hire a proper staff and learn how to fill out paperwork. Rachel grinned, nudging Jake. Reynolds and Chen Consulting. I think that has a nice ring to it. The tribunal dismissed, but Thera caught Jake in the observation deck afterward. The crowds had left, leaving just the two of them looking out at the stars through the massive windows. You should know something, Thera said quietly, her cold diplomatic mask dropping. I'm not celebrating this decision. Your species genuinely terrifies me. Why? Jake asked. Because you make other species question their limitations. Every species in the consortium has learned to accept certain boundaries, things that simply cannot be done. We've built our entire civilization on understanding and respecting those limits. She turned to face him directly. But humans? You don't just solve problems. You make people believe that problems can be solved. That hope is contagious, Mr. Reynolds. And hope is very, very dangerous to systems built on acceptance of reality. Jake smiled. Sounds like a you problem, Ambassador. Despite herself, Thera laughed. Perhaps it is. 3 months later, Jake stood in his new workshop, a proper facility now 10 times the size of his old repair dock. 12 engineers worked at various stations, humans and aliens learning from each other. Requests flooded in daily from across the consortium. Rachel walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, setting one on his workbench. Got another request. Novari child born without the ability to perceive colors. Parents are asking if human madness might help her see a sunset for the first time. Jake pulled up the specifications, studying the Novari visual system. Would be challenging. Probably impossible by consortium standards. Another impossible project? Rachel asked. Is there any other kind? Jake replied, already sketching designs. Across the galaxy, Lyra's latest victory speech played on screens in 1 billion homes, her words translated into countless languages. She stood on the winner's platform, the championship trophy in her hands, smiling at cameras from every major news network. A human taught me that impossible is just another word for not yet, she said. And if we all believed that, if we all refused to accept limitations, imagine what we could accomplish. Jake smiled, watching the broadcast while starting work on his next impossible project. Humans had brought chaos to the consortium's order. And maybe, just maybe, that chaos was exactly what the galaxy needed.